She walked into every room like she already owned it. The posture of a ballerina, the voice of someone who had nothing left to prove, and a smile that could cut glass or charm a nation into watching her every Sunday night. For decades, Diahann Carroll was one of the most recognizable faces in American entertainment. But behind the image of polished composure was a life marked by broken promises, dangerous choices, grief, and a career built entirely on battles she was never supposed to win. This is the life and loves of Diahann Carroll, the elegant rebel of Hollywood. Part 1. The Girl from the Bronx. She was born Carroll Diane Johnson on July 17th, 1935, in the Bronx, New York, the first child of John Johnson, a subway conductor, and Mabel Falk, a nurse. Shortly after her birth, the family moved to Harlem, the neighborhood that would shape who she became. It was a community of extraordinary cultural energy in the 1930s and 1940s, full of music, ambition, and a particular understanding that excellence was the price of admission for people who looked like her family. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of Black Americans from the South to cities like New York, and Harlem had become not just a neighborhood, but a statement that Black life could be rich, complex, creative, and entirely its own. Her parents were quietly extraordinary in their own right. They enrolled her in singing, dancing, and modeling classes almost from the time she could stand. Her mother was devoted to the idea that her daughter would be exceptional, and the evidence appeared early. By the time Diahann was 6 years old, she was singing with her church choir in Harlem. By 10, she had received a Metropolitan Opera scholarship that placed her at the High School of Music and Art in Manhattan, the same school where she would share classrooms with a fellow future star, Billy D. Williams. The scholarship was not a token gesture. It was recognition that this child had a voice worth cultivating seriously. She was a beautiful child who grew into a striking teenager, and she knew it without being vain about it. By 15, she was modeling for Ebony magazine, one of the most widely read Black publications in America, which made appearances there a significant cultural marker. The same year, under the name she had chosen for herself, Diahann Carroll, more exotic and distinctive than Carroll Johnson, she entered Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts radio program. She was 16, poised, and entirely certain that she was going somewhere. She won the contest and performed on the accompanying radio show for 3 weeks. Word spread. She enrolled at New York University to study sociology, a subject she chose with genuine intellectual interest, not merely as a placeholder. But she left before graduating, making a promise to her family that if the career hadn't materialized within 2 years, she would return to college. She was not the kind of person who made empty promises, but she was also not the kind of person who needed 2 years. At 18, she appeared on the Dumont television network program, Chance of a Lifetime, won the $1,000 top prize with a rendition of Why Was I Born?, a Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein II song that she delivered with a maturity and control that made the audience understand they were watching something different, and was booked by entertainment promoter Lou Walters, father of Barbara Walters, into the Latin Quarter nightclub for a full engagement. That same year, she made her Broadway debut in Harold Arlen and Truman Capote's musical House of Flowers, holding her own alongside the formidable Pearl Bailey. She played a young ingenue in a show set in a Caribbean bordello, and she introduced 2 songs, A Sleepin' Bee and I Never Has Seen Snow, that Barbara Streisand would later record, which tells you something about the quality of the material she was given. She was 19 years old. The most consequential decades of her life were still ahead, and so were the most consequential heartbreaks. What mattered at 19 was that the career had begun in the way she had promised herself it would, not by luck, not by a single fortunate break, but by a sustained accumulation of preparation, opportunity seized, and a refusal to wait for permission. The girl from the Bronx, raised in Harlem, trained at the High School of Music and Art, had made it to Broadway and to the screen and to a nightclub on Broadway's edge, all before she was 20. What came next would test the composure she had been building since she was 6 years old, singing in church. It would test it repeatedly, and at significant cost, but it would never break it. Part 2. The Golden Age and the Broken Door. The 1950s should have been straightforward for Diahann Carroll. She had the talent. She had the presence. She had been noticed by the right people. But Hollywood in the 1950s was not in the business of being straightforward about what it would offer a black woman of ambition, regardless of how clearly that ambition was backed by ability. The industry's relationship with black performers operated through a series of unwritten but firmly maintained constraints. Leading roles were not available. Supporting roles in mainstream productions were limited and often confined to domestic characters or background figures. The alternative was the black cast film, a format that had emerged partly from studio calculations about separate audience markets and partly from the genuine star power of performers like Dorothy Dandridge, whose beauty and ability had made her impossible to ignore. Carroll appeared alongside Dandridge in Carmen Jones in 1954, a vivid adaptation of Bizet's opera with an all-black cast, directed by Otto Preminger. Carroll played a supporting role. She was not yet the lead, but she was in the frame, and people noticed her. 5 years later, she appeared again with Dandridge in Preminger's Porgy and Bess, the 1959 film based on Gershwin's opera, starring Sidney Poitier and Sammy Davis Jr. Carroll played Clara. Her character's singing parts were dubbed by opera singer Luli John Norman, a condition Carroll found professionally frustrating and which illustrated the particular indignities that accompanied even successful appearances. She was there, but not entirely on her own terms. Even producer Sam Goldwyn, who held enormous power over the production, demonstrated the particular way authority was wielded against black performers during this era. Carroll, in her memoir, described a confrontation with Goldwyn in his office over a costume decision, a bandana she had not wanted to wear on screen. When he berated her in a manner she found inappropriate, she responded with a directness that many people in her position would not have dared. She told him calmly that not even her own father spoke to her in that manner, but that she would be happy to discuss the bandana if he wished. She did not apologize. She was not fired. Between those two films, she had been working at a pace that most people would find exhausting. Nightclub appearances across the country, television guest spots with Jack Parr, Steve Allen, Ed Sullivan, and other variety program hosts, recording sessions, radio work. She released Diahann Carroll Sings, Harold Arlen's Songs, in 1957. She was building something, not just a career but a persona, in the spaces between the major roles she was not yet being offered in lead positions. The nightclub circuit in particular gave her something the film studios could not: complete control over how she presented herself, without a director's vision or a studio's anxieties about audience reception mediating between her and the people watching. In 1961, she appeared in Paris Blues alongside Paul Newman, Joanne Woodward, and Sidney Poitier in a film about American jazz musicians living in Paris. It was a significant production, with major names attached. She was still not the lead, but she was in the room with the biggest names in American film, and she conducted herself accordingly. The year after Paris Blues is where the ledger changed permanently. In 1962, composer Richard Rodgers, working without Oscar Hammerstein for the first time after Hammerstein's death in 1960, wrote a Broadway musical specifically for Diahann Carroll. The show was called No Strings. Carroll played Barbara Woodruff, an American fashion model living in Paris, in an interracial romance with a writer played by Richard Kiley. The show's title referred both to the absence of a string section in the orchestra and to the freedom of the characters from convention, which, in 1962 America, was a quietly radical statement to embed in a Broadway musical. Carroll won the Tony Award for Best Actress in a Musical. She was the first black woman ever to receive that honor. The award didn't eliminate the structural limitations of an industry still navigating what it believed its audiences would or would not accept. But it put a name on what she was: exceptional, undeniable, and not going anywhere. The significance of that particular first is worth pausing on. Broadway had existed in its modern form for decades before 1962. The Tony Award for Best Actress had been given every year since 1947. Diahann Carroll was the first black woman to receive it in 1962. The people who had been performing on Broadway before her, the Ethel Watters, the Lena Hornes, the Pearl Baileys, had done extraordinary work without receiving the industry's highest recognition in this category. Carroll's win was a correction, but it was also a reminder of how many corrections had not yet come. She was 36 years old at the time of the Tony and had been in the public eye for over a decade. She had released multiple albums. She had appeared in films alongside the biggest names in Hollywood. She had guest starred on the most watched television variety programs in the country. None of that had resulted in the kind of leading role, headlining career that her talent clearly warranted. The Tony was real recognition. It was also a measure of how much had been withheld before it arrived. She accepted it with the composure that was her signature, and she returned to work. What nobody in the audience at No Strings knew, and what Carroll herself was still in the middle of, was that even as she was collecting the most prestigious award of her stage career, her personal life had been turned inside out by a relationship that had already lasted 3 years, showed no sign of ending cleanly, and involved the most famous black actor in the world. What that relationship cost her, and what it eventually required her to give up, is the part of the story that the awards rarely mention. Part 3. Sidney Poitier and 9 Years of Broken Promises. They met on the set of Porgy and Bess in 1959. He was Sidney Poitier, already one of the most significant actors in American cinema, already on his way to becoming the first black man to win the Academy Award for Best Actor, which he would receive in 1964. She was Diahann Carroll, rising, brilliant, and at that moment still married to her first husband, record producer Monty Kaye, with whom she had a daughter, Suzanne, born in 1960. Poitier was also married. His wife was Juanita Hardy, with whom he had 4 daughters. None of this stopped either of them. Poitier later described the pull he felt toward Carroll from their first days on the set as something that transcended ordinary attraction. He spoke about her cheekbones and her eyes, and her confidence and her intelligence, calling her one of the brightest women he had ever encountered. He asked her to dinner, and they agreed they would talk about their respective marriages and nothing more. They talked about their marriages, and then they kept meeting. The affair ran from 1959 until 1968. 9 years of an intensity and an instability that Carroll documented with remarkable candor in her 2008 memoir, The Legs Are the Last to Go. Poitier, according to Carroll's account, persuaded her to end her marriage to Monty Kaye, telling her he would leave his wife and they would begin their lives together openly. Carroll proceeded with her divorce. Poitier did not immediately keep his side of the arrangement. He remained in his marriage to Juanita Hardy, while Carroll was now single, having done what he asked. While Poitier remained in his marriage, Carroll dated other men, an entirely reasonable response to being alone after ending a marriage on the basis of a promise that had not been kept. When Poitier discovered this, he appeared at her hotel room one night in a state of fury, claiming her for himself, despite having made her no firm commitment. He told her, in words she later recounted in her memoir, that she belonged to him. The possessiveness of that moment, set against his continued marriage to someone else, captures the particular shape the relationship held for years. His terms, on his timetable, with Carroll waiting in the position he had placed her in without having secured his own side of the arrangement. Eventually, Poitier did divorce Juanita Hardy in 1965. He bought Carroll a ring. He purchased a 10-room apartment on Riverside Drive in New York, which Carroll spent time decorating according to her taste, preparing to move in with her daughter Suzanne. The plan was that they would live together in the apartment for 6 months before marrying, Poitier explaining he did not want to move directly from one marriage into another. Days after Carroll had moved in, the terms changed again. Poitier told her he did not want her daughter living with them. When Carroll refused to accept this condition, he changed the locks on the apartment door. He then asked her to reimburse him for the purchase and decorating costs of a home she had prepared to live in with her child. Carroll wrote in her memoir that she did as she was told. She used the word submissive to describe herself in those moments. For a woman of her bearing, her accomplishments, her very particular command of any room she entered, that word carries enormous weight. It is the gap between what she showed the world and what the private cost had been. Poitier later wrote, in his own memoir, that the guilt he carried from that period of his life was something that years of therapy had not fully resolved. He described the pain of it without disguising it. Both accounts, read together, are the portrait of two people who made each other suffer in ways they were each too proud and too occupied with their own needs to fully protect against. The relationship ended in 1968. Poitier went on to marry actress Joanna Shimkus in 1976. Carroll, much later in life, wrote that she and Poitier had found their way to friendship, that the distance of years had made room for forgiveness. She described the feeling as something lovely that comes with age. Whether it arrived easily or cost something further to reach, only she would have known. But the Poitier chapter, as consuming as it was not the last complicated relationship she would navigate, and the next ones would be darker in different ways. Part 4. Julia and the Weight of a First. In the fall of 1968, a television program called Julia debuted on NBC. It starred Diahann Carroll as Julia Baker, a widowed nurse raising her young son Corey while working for the doctor at an aerospace company. The show ran for 86 episodes over 3 seasons, earning strong ratings in its first 2 years and producing both a Golden Globe Award for Carroll, for Best TV Star, Female, and an Emmy nomination in 1969. What the awards don't fully capture is what Julia actually meant in the context of American television history. Carroll was the first African-American woman to star in her own television series, in which her character was not a servant, a slave, or a domestic worker of any kind. The first. In 1968. In a country that had been broadcasting television for over 2 decades. To put that in context, Mattel created a Julia Baker doll in Carroll's image. A black woman was on American television as a professional, a mother, a fully realized human being. And the cultural resonance was significant enough that a toy company decided it was worth manufacturing. The show debuted on September 17, 1968, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and 2 months after the assassination of Robert Kennedy. It arrived into a country in upheaval, and it offered something entirely different from that upheaval. A serene, middle-class, professionally competent black woman navigating ordinary life. Her husband's death in Vietnam, referenced in the show's backstory, gave Julia a quiet connection to the war that most television productions of the era deliberately avoided. It was doing something with the political context, even if it was not doing it loudly. The critical response was divided from the start. Many praised the historic significance of having a black woman in a lead role at all. Others, including voices within the black community and from civil rights activists, argued that the show was too comfortable, too removed from the realities of black urban life in America. The Saturday Review called Julia's setting a far, far cry from the bitter realities of Negro life in the urban ghetto. Carroll herself, in a 1968 interview, acknowledged the tension, describing the character as something close to a white Negro, meaning a black character whose life closely mirrored white middle-class television norms rather than the specific texture of black American experience at that moment. It was an honest assessment, and it illustrated the particular impossible position Carroll occupied. Having fought to be seen in a lead role on American television, she then had to contend with the criticism that the role she had been given was not radical enough. She was both trailblazer and target. Carroll ended the series in 1971 at her own request, reportedly having grown tired of the controversy that had surrounded it from its first episode. 86 episodes over 3 years, and she walked away. That decision told its own story about who she was, someone for whom the historic significance of a milestone did not require her to stay in it indefinitely once it had stopped serving her. It is worth noting what was happening during those Julia years on a personal level. Carroll had been married to her first husband, record producer Monty Kaye, to whom she was wed in 1956 in a ceremony at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, officiated by Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. Her father did not attend. The marriage ended in 1962, the same year she won the Tony. They had one daughter together, Suzanne K. Bamford, born on September 9, 1960, who later became a journalist and screenwriter. The dissolution of that marriage had happened largely because of the Sidney Poitier situation, which had run parallel to Carroll's professional ascent for years. Poitier had encouraged her to leave Monty Kaye. She had. And then the years of waiting had followed. By the time Julia was on the air, the Poitier chapter was closing. Carroll was entering the phase of her life in which she would make 4 attempts at lasting partnership, with results that ranged from devastating to tender to genuinely painful. Part 5. The Marriages, the Grief, and the Diver. In February 1973, Carroll married Fred Glussman, a Las Vegas boutique owner. The marriage lasted 4 months. Carroll filed for divorce, citing physical abuse from Glussman. The divorce was finalized 2 months later. There is very little more to say about Fred Glussman that is flattering, and Carroll did not attempt to say it. She had, in the years between the end of Julia and this marriage, been engaged to British television host and producer David Frost, a relationship that began around 1970 and lasted until 1973, when Frost and Carroll ended their engagement without publicly explaining the reasons. The press had been surprised by the Glussman marriage, partly because many people assumed Carroll and Frost would eventually marry. What followed was the marriage that, by Carroll's own account, was the most genuinely loving of her 4. In May 1975, when she was 39 years old, she married Robert DeLeon, the 24-year-old managing editor of Jet magazine. They had met when DeLeon assigned himself to write a cover story about Carroll's Oscar nomination for the 1974 film Claudine, and then pursued her in earnest after their first meeting. That Oscar nomination deserves its own moment here. Claudine had been written specifically for actress Diana Sands, a close friend of Carroll's and a former guest star on Julia, where she had played Carroll's cousin, Sarah. Sands was a performer of extraordinary ability who had earned significant recognition and was considered one of the most gifted dramatic actresses of her generation. Shortly before filming was to begin on Claudine, Sands received the news that she was terminally ill with cancer. She attempted to begin production anyway, determined not to lose the role. As filming started, it became clear she was too ill to continue. Sands recommended her friend Carroll take the role. Carroll stepped in. She played Claudine, a Harlem woman raising 6 children on her own while navigating poverty, welfare regulations, and a new relationship with a sanitation worker played by James Earl Jones. It was a role that required Carroll to set aside the elegance and polish that had been her signature, to appear, for once, as someone for whom survival was a daily calculation rather than a given. The performance earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. Diana Sands died in September 1973, before the film was released. When Claudine came out in April 1974, Carroll carried the knowledge that the role she was being celebrated for had been entrusted to her by a dying friend. That is not a small thing to carry. Carroll carried it with the same composure she brought to everything. The age difference between Carroll and Diahann drew attention, as age differences between women and younger men reliably do. Carroll largely did not engage with the commentary. She had been in rooms full of people who expected her to be otherwise for most of her adult life, and she had not rearranged herself for any of them. Diahann was, by accounts from people who knew them together, genuinely devoted to her. Carroll moved to Chicago to be near his work at Jet magazine, which was headquartered there. When Diahann eventually left his position at Jet, the couple relocated to Oakland, California. They were building something real, something that felt different from the previous attempts at partnership. On March 31st, 1977, Robert Diahann was killed in a car crash in Beverly Hills. He was 26 years old. Carroll was 41. She absorbed the loss without public collapse, the way she absorbed most things, with the composed exterior that had been both her armor and her public face for as long as she had been known. What it cost privately, she kept to herself. The grief of losing someone so young, so devoted, under such sudden circumstances, is the kind that does not resolve. It simply becomes part of the architecture of a person. The career continued, as it always had. Part 6. Dominique Devereaux and the Art of Being Magnificent. Dynasty was the defining primetime soap opera of the 1980s, a world of enormous shoulder pads, operatic family conflicts, extraordinary wealth, and a very specific grammar of glamour that the decade had perfected. Joan Collins, as Alexis Carrington, had established the show's particular flavour of magnificent scheming. The show was one of the most watched programs on American television, and it trafficked in a kind of excess that was perfectly calibrated to the decade's appetite for it. In 1984, at the end of the show's 4th season, the producers introduced a new character. Dominique Devereaux, the mixed-race jet-set diva revealed to be the half-sister of Carrington patriarch Blake, played by John Forsythe. The character was designed for confrontation, for glamour, for the kind of entrance that makes an entire scene reorganize itself around the person who has just walked through the door. Carroll played Dominique with a controlled ferocity that made every scene feel like the opening of a negotiation she had already won. Where Alexis was all operatic menace, Dominique had a different quality, an imperious self-possession that came from Carroll's decades of practice at being the most polished person in any room while having to fight for the right to be there. The two characters orbited each other with the mutual wariness of two women who recognized exactly what the other was doing, even if neither would admit it. Audiences who had missed Julia, or who had grown up after it encountered Diahann Carroll for the first time through Dominique Devereaux, and the impression was indelible. The show gave her a platform that reached tens of millions of viewers and demanded exactly the particular combination of elegance and steel that was her singular gift. She was 50 years old when she joined the show. She was being handed the keys to one of the most visible characters on American television at an age when the industry typically considered women her age past their moment. She treated the opportunity accordingly. The reunion with her high school classmate Billy D. Williams, who briefly played her on-screen husband Brady Lloyd on Dynasty, added a layer of warmth that audiences felt without needing to know its source. Two people who had been teenagers together at the High School of Music and Art in Harlem decades later, sharing a screen on one of the most watched television programs in the country. The arc of that is something. Carroll remained on Dynasty through the 7th season in 1987, with additional appearances on its spin-off The Colbys. She had entered the show at an age when most actresses of her generation had been pushed to peripheral roles. She left it, having become, again and differently, one of the most recognizable performers on American television. In 1987, she also married for the 4th time. Singer Vic Damone, a popular traditional pop artist who had scored hits across several decades, became her 4th and final husband. Their wedding took place at the Golden Nugget Casino in Atlantic City on January 3rd, 1987. Carroll acknowledged freely that the marriage was turbulent, a word that in the context of her memoir writing carried real weight. They legally separated in 1991, reconciled, and eventually divorced in 1996, nearly a decade after the wedding. Diahann died in 2018. The public record of their time together suggests it was difficult in ways that Carroll chose not to catalogue in detail, and the privacy of that restraint deserves respect. She emerged from the Damone marriage, and from the Dynasty chapter, and from the accumulated weight of her adult life, as something the world doesn't always allow women to become. Someone in her 50s and 60s who simply continued on her own terms, doing exactly what she chose to do. And then came the news that changed the terms once more. Part 7. The Cancer, the Candor, and the Final Chapters. In 1997, Diahann Carroll was diagnosed with breast cancer. She later said the diagnosis stunned her, that there was no family history of the disease, and that she had always lived what she considered a healthy life. She underwent 9 weeks of radiation therapy. The cancer went into remission. She was 62 years old, still working, still immaculate, still entirely herself. She did not go quietly into the role of patient or survivor. She became one of the most visible voices in public conversation about breast cancer awareness, particularly in the Black community, where discussions about the disease carried additional weight given historical inequities in access to healthcare, and the cultural pressure many Black women felt to project strength over vulnerability. She appeared in the 2010 documentary One a Minute, alongside other women speaking about breast cancer. She spoke at events, gave interviews, and used the platform she had spent 5 decades building to ensure that the conversation reached people who might otherwise not be having it. In a 2016 interview, she recalled the moment after her diagnosis, looking out the window of her Beverly Hills home and quietly addressing herself as Miss Carroll, thinking, in that composed internal voice that had always been her particular register, that she hoped she had enjoyed what she was seeing. That image is very Diahann Carroll. Even the private confrontation with a terrifying diagnosis was met with a kind of formal, dry self-possession. She had been performing composure for so long, it had become her native language. Her career in those late years moved between television, theatre, and film, with the ease of someone who had worked in all three for half a century and saw no reason to stop. She played the role of Norma Desmond in the Canadian production of Andrew Lloyd Webber's Sunset Boulevard in 1996, the first African-American actress to take on that iconic role, playing a silent screen diva who could not let go of the past. There was something fitting in the casting that the production may not have intended. A woman who had spent decades fighting for the right to be recognized, choosing to play a woman whose tragedy was being seen too much by the wrong people and not seen at all by the right ones. She appeared in Eve's Bayou in 1997, the critically celebrated Southern Gothic drama directed by Cassie Lemons, in which she played Aunt Moselle, a woman with the gift of premonition who nonetheless cannot steer her own life away from grief. She played one of the century-old Delaney sisters in Having Our Say, The Delaney Sisters, First 100 Years, in 1999, a television film based on the best-selling memoir. She had a recurring role on Grey's Anatomy from 2006 to 2007 as Jane Burke, the formidable mother of Dr. Preston Burke, a performance that introduced her to yet another generation of viewers who recognized immediately that this was someone who had been at the center of things long before their time. In 2011, she was inducted into the Television Academy Hall of Fame. The ceremony placed her formally in the institutional record as someone who had changed what television was, not merely what it contained. She made her last public New York nightclub appearance in 2006, when the New York Times described her as an astonishingly youthful and glamorous 70-year-old grandmother who presented herself with the down-to-earth honesty of someone who had earned every word she was saying. The reviewer used the phrase, casually worn grandeur, which is as accurate a description as any. The cancer returned in her final years. She spent her last period in West Hollywood, managing her health with the same private composure she had brought to every other difficult thing. Her daughter, Suzanne Kay, was with her. Diahann Carroll died on October 4th, 2019. She was 84 years old. Part 8. What She Left Behind. The tributes that followed described her as a trailblazer, a legend, an icon. All of those words are accurate, and none of them quite captures the specific texture of what she did. She was the first black woman to win the Tony Award for Best Actress in a musical in 1962. She was the first black woman to star in a leading role in her own American television series in a non-stereotypical part in 1968. She was the first African-American actress to play Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard in 1996. In 2011, she was inducted into the Television Academy Hall of Fame. She received a Golden Globe Award in 1968, an Academy Award nomination in 1974, and 5 Emmy nominations across her career. Each of those firsts arrived decades after they should have, which is the specific weight carried by being the first at anything in a world that had been withholding the opportunity. She collected those firsts not as trophies, but as evidence of ground claimed by force of excellence, ground that other women would be able to stand on after her. Mattel created a Julia Baker doll in her image. That is a specific kind of legacy. The children who played with that doll grew up having had, in their earliest sense of what was normal, the image of a black woman as a professional, a mother, a lead character. The doll existed because Carroll fought to be on television in the way she was, and it worked. She was married 4 times. To record producer Monty Kaye from 1956 to 1962, in a ceremony officiated by Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. To Fred Glusman briefly in 1973, a marriage she ended due to his abuse. To Robert de Leon from May 1975 until his death on March 31st, 1977. and to Vic Damone from 1987 to 1996. She had one child, her daughter, Suzanne Kay. She was, over the course of her life, someone who loved with an intensity that sometimes outpaced the readiness of the people she loved. She trusted promises that were made with less commitment than they were received. She left situations, eventually, every time. She wrote her autobiography with a candor that makes readers uncomfortable in the best possible way, naming what had happened, naming her own part in it, moving forward without performing either shame or resolution. Late in her life, reflecting on her 4 marriages and what she had learned from them, she said something that carried the weight of genuine self-knowledge, that she had spent too much of her life expecting other people to make her extremely happy, and had only come to understand, much later, that nobody else can do that. She said she had been an old lady before she worked it out. She survived a 9-year affair that cost her a marriage and a decade of her life. She survived physical abuse in a marriage she ended in 4 months. She survived the sudden death of a young husband she had loved genuinely. She survived breast cancer twice. She survived 5 decades in an industry that had been designed, at almost every level, to make someone who looked like her invisible or marginal or secondary. And she did all of it in beautiful clothes, with perfect posture, and never once looked like she was going to break. That is not a definition of elegance. But it is one of the truest arguments for what elegance can be. Not the absence of difficulty, but the decision to meet it without surrendering your shape. Diahann Carroll never surrendered her shape. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. London, September 18th, 1970. A quiet apartment in Notting Hill. The most gifted electric guitarist the world had ever heard was found unresponsive that morning. By 12:45 in the afternoon, he was dead, 27 years old. Internationally famous for exactly 4 years. What led to that morning is a story most people have never heard in full. This is the story of the genius that burned too fast. The boy in the closet. He was born Johnny Allen Hendricks at King County Hospital in Seattle, Washington, on November 27th, 1942. His father, Al Hendricks, was 22 years old and stationed with the U.S. Army in Alabama when the birth happened. He was not permitted to take leave. His mother, Lucille Jeter, was 17. They had married earlier that year, spent 3 days together as a married couple, and then Al was shipped out to the Pacific. The baby who would change music forever entered the world with his father absent and his mother barely out of childhood herself. Al returned from the war and the family reunited, settling in Seattle's Central District, a predominantly black neighborhood, where they bounced between small apartments and modest housing projects. The household during Jimmy's early years was defined less by stability than by the absence of it. Both parents drank. The apartment became a regular gathering place for late-night company. Young Jimmy, as everyone called him, dealt with the noise and the arguments by retreating to his closet. He would sit there in the dark until things quieted. He developed a stutter. He invented an imaginary friend he called Cessa. He was so shy that he could barely make eye contact with people he met for the first time, and he mumbled so quietly that classmates often asked him to repeat himself. Al changed his son's name in September 1946 from Johnny Allen to James Marshall Hendricks, naming him after his own father and a late brother. The name Jimmy would come much later. Lucille was an unreliable presence throughout those years. She came and went for weeks at a time without warning, sometimes disappearing for stretches that left Al to manage both boys entirely on his own, relying on extended family members and neighbors to fill the gaps. Jimmy and Leon were cared for primarily by their father, supplemented by whoever was available. Jimmy wore second-hand clothing. He wore shoes with holes in the soles. His grade school classmates at Leshy Elementary School remembered a quiet, pigeon-toed boy who mumbled when he spoke and seemed to exist mostly inside his own head. His teachers noted that he was creative, that his drawings used colours that were more vivid and less conventional than the other children's, but that he struggled to engage with the ordinary rhythms of classroom life. When Lucille was present, Jimmy idolised her. She had long dark hair and a wide smile, and to a young boy who rarely saw her, her appearances carried the particular magic of things that are scarce. He defended her in conversations with his friends, who sometimes assumed from her constant absences that she must have died. He did not correct them directly. He simply said his mother was fine. He had the deep, unreasonable love of a child for a parent who is too often gone. On February 2nd, 1958, Lucille Hendricks died. Her liver had been destroyed by years of heavy drinking, and her spleen ruptured. She was 32 years old. Jimmy was 15. Al did not take him to the funeral. The death was announced to him, and then the matter was largely set aside, because grief without ceremony or acknowledgement is simply grief that goes nowhere and stays inside. The wound that created, the loss of a woman he had already mostly lost, compounded by the absence of any proper mourning, ran through everything he did afterward. People who knew him well in his adult years described a particular quality of loneliness in him that no amount of fame or adulation could fully reach. The music could reach it. Very little else could. But the music was still a few years away. First, there was the broom, one string at a time. The story of how Jimi Hendrix learned to play guitar is one of the most remarkable in the history of popular music, not because it was aided by exceptional resources or instruction, but because it happened almost entirely without them. During his years at Horace Mann Elementary in the mid-1950s, a school social worker noticed something persistent about one of her students. Jimi Hendrix carried a broom with him at all times, held it the way a guitarist holds an instrument, and moved his fingers across the bristled end as if working frets. He was not being disruptive. He was not doing it for attention. He simply could not stop. The social worker found the behavior significant enough to write a formal letter to the school district requesting that funds allocated for underprivileged children be used to buy Jimmy a guitar. The district said no. Al, when approached, also refused. He had no money for luxuries, and a guitar struck him as one. In 1957, while helping his father haul garbage and furniture from an older woman's house as a side job, Jimmy found a one-stringed ukulele in the pile of discarded items. The woman told him he could keep it. He took it home and started teaching himself to play single notes, following along by ear to songs on the radio. Elvis Presley's recording of Hound Dog was one of the first things he worked out. In the summer of 1958, Al relented and bought him a proper acoustic guitar, a second-hand instrument that cost $5. From the moment it was in his hands, the guitar rarely left them. He played for hours every day, listening to records by Muddy Waters, B.B. King, Howlin' Wolf, and Robert Johnson, and absorbing not just the notes, but the physical vocabulary of the instrument, the string bends, the vibrato, the way a single sustained note could carry emotion if you held it at exactly the right angle. There was an immediate and significant problem. Jimmy was left-handed. Every guitar available to him was strung for a right-handed player. Rather than try to learn to play in reverse, he flipped the instrument over and restrung it upside down, putting the lower strings where they would sit naturally for his fretting hand. This meant every chord shape, every scale, every technique he ever developed had to be invented from personal experimentation rather than received instruction. He had no teacher. There were no instruction books for left-handed players. He invented his approach from scratch, which is a large part of why his approach turned out to be unlike anyone else's. He wasn't learning a known system and adapting it. He was building a completely original one, 1 hour of practice at a time. By his mid-teens, he was playing in bands around Seattle, performing at dances and small clubs. He was fired from his first paying gig for showing off. He had played behind his back during a set, and the bandleader found it disrespectful to the other musicians. He joined a group called the Rocking Kings, had his guitar stolen backstage at a venue where he had left it overnight, and had Al replace it with a red Silvertone Dane Electro. Then came the legal trouble that changed the direction of everything. Before he turned 19, Jimmy was caught twice riding in stolen cars. When he appeared before a judge the second time, the options presented were prison or the army. He chose the army and enlisted on May 31st, 1961. He was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, the Screaming Eagles. He completed 26 parachute jumps, earned his Screaming Eagles patch, and wrote home asking for his guitar to be sent because it was the only thing making the rest of it bearable. At Fort Campbell, he met a bassist named Billy Cox, and the two of them began playing together whenever they had time away from duty. Cox was a solid, grounded musician with good instincts and no ambitions that conflicted with Hendrix's, and the friendship and musical partnership that formed at Fort Campbell would prove to be one of the most durable relationships of Hendrix's life. Cox was still playing beside him on the last tour. The Army discharged Hendrix in July 1962. By most accounts, the combination of an injury from a parachute jump and a thoroughly documented inability to concentrate on anything except the guitar had made him a poor fit for military service. The discharge was honourable, and from that day forward, there was nothing left between Jimi Hendrix and the music. Years in the margins. The 4 years from 1962 to 1966 are the least celebrated chapter of Jimi Hendrix's story, which is remarkable given how much they required of him. He spent those years moving between cities, backing major artists on the rhythm and blues circuit, living in near poverty, and earning almost no recognition from an industry that had not yet realized what it was looking at. After leaving the Army, he moved to Clarksville, Tennessee, then Nashville, then eventually New York. He found his way onto the Chitlin Circuit, the network of black-owned venues, theaters, and clubs that served African-American audiences during an era when the American music establishment was still largely segregated by race. The musicians who worked the circuit were among the most skilled and demanding in the country. Playing it was an education that no conservatory could have replicated. Night after night, in front of audiences that knew exactly what good playing sounded like and had no patience for anything less. He worked as a backing guitarist for the Isley Brothers in 1964, learning what it meant to serve a song and a show rather than to dominate it. He toured with Little Richard through 1964 and into 1965. Little Richard's show was a precision operation, and Little Richard himself was not a man who accepted being upstaged. The problem was that every time Hendrix picked up the guitar, upstaging became almost inevitable. He wore clothing that was too flamboyant. He extended his solos beyond the allotted time. He played lines that pulled attention away from wherever Richard was standing. The relationship was one of recurring friction, with Hendrix getting fired and rehired in a cycle that lasted longer than it probably should have. He played behind Sam Cooke, Wilson Pickett, Ike and Tina Turner, and Curtis Knight and the Squires at various points during those years. Every engagement had roughly the same texture. Hendrix would arrive, play with an ability that was categorically beyond what the situation called for, and eventually find himself either fired or frustrated enough to leave. He played behind his back. He played with the guitar between his legs. He pulled feedback out of his amplifier and used it as a melodic element rather than something to be avoided. He bent strings past points that most guitarists treated as limits. He created distorted sounds that were deliberate and expressive rather than accidental. The musicians he backed wanted someone who would support the show. What they got instead was the most interesting thing in the room. By 1966, he had settled in New York's Greenwich Village and formed a group called Jimmy James and the Blue Flames. They played the Café Wah and other village clubs. And for the first time, Hendrix was fronting his own band, playing his own material, answering to no one's expectations except his own. He was 23 years old, living in one of the cheapest rooms he could find, eating irregularly, and virtually unknown outside a tight circle of New York musicians. But something was happening in those sets that the people who witnessed them found very difficult to describe clearly. The best most of them could manage afterward was some version of, once he started playing, nothing else in the room existed. Chas Chandler, the former bassist of the Animals, was in the process of leaving the band and looking toward a career in management when a friend brought him to see Hendrix play at the Café Wah in the summer of 1966. He watched the set and made his decision quickly. He approached Hendrix, offered to take him to London, and said that the city would understand what he was doing in a way that America had not yet managed. Hendrix, who had spent 4 years being invisible in his own country, agreed without much hesitation. What followed happened faster than almost anyone involved had anticipated. London and the lightning bolt. In September 1966, Jimi Hendrix arrived in London. Within days, the city's rock world was in a state of shock that it had not expected and did not know how to describe. Chandler introduced him to musicians, booked him into clubs, arranged for him to sit in on sessions, and made sure the right people were in the room when Hendrix played. The people who encountered him in those first weeks included Eric Clapton, at that point widely regarded as the finest rock guitarist in Britain, coming off the enormous success of Cream, Pete Townshend of The Who, Paul McCartney, and John Lennon. Clapton's reaction has become one of the most repeated stories in rock history. He heard Hendrix play and was reportedly so disoriented by the experience that he told friends afterward he wasn't sure he could continue performing. Whether the specific anecdote is embellished or precise, the underlying response it describes is confirmed by Clapton himself in various interviews. Hendrix had made everything Clapton thought he knew about playing the guitar feel insufficient. Chandler helped assemble a band. The bassist was Noel Redding, a guitarist who had come in to audition for a completely different role and ended up on bass because the position was open and Redding could hold a rhythm. The drummer was Mitch Mitchell, a jazz-trained player with the improvisational flexibility to follow Hendrix in real time rather than locking into a fixed pattern. The three of them became the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Chandler had one final adjustment, the spelling of the first name. Jimmy became Jimmy. In December 1966, the Experience released their debut UK single, Hey Joe. It reached number 6 on the British charts. Purple Haze followed in March 1967 and climbed to number 3. The Wind Cries Mary came in May. Before the band had even released their first album, all 3 singles were top 10 hits in Britain. When Are You Experienced? Finally arrived in May 1967, critics and listeners scrambled to find language for what they were hearing. The album operated by rules that seemed to have been invented specifically for it. The feedback wasn't accidental, the distortion wasn't excessive. Every sound had been deliberately chosen. It was not a debut album in the conventional sense. It was an announcement. The American breakthrough came at the Monterey Pop Festival in California in June 1967. The Experience performed a set that ended with Hendrix kneeling over his guitar, dousing it in lighter fluid, setting it on fire, and smashing the burning remains against the amplifiers. It was theatre, certainly. It was also an entirely intentional statement about what kind of musician had arrived. The photographs of that moment circulated across newspapers and magazines, and America, which had largely been unaware of the man who had been living and working within its own borders for years, suddenly knew his name. The next 2 years produced music that changed everything and cost him more than anyone around him admitted. The machine and the man inside it. Between 1967 and 1969, Jimi Hendrix made 3 studio albums, toured almost without interruption, and became by 1969 the highest-paid rock musician in the world. The achievement was real and extraordinary. So was the cost. His manager, Michael Jeffrey, had co-managed the Experience alongside Chas Chandler from the beginning, but by the late 1960s, Chandler had stepped back from the arrangement, and Jeffrey was running Hendrix's business affairs alone. Jeffrey was, by the accounts of virtually every biographer and musician who has examined his record, a manager whose primary concern was his own financial position. Multiple people who dealt with him professionally have described him as someone who redirected portions of Hendrix's income into offshore bank accounts, who structured deals in ways that were advantageous to himself and difficult for his client to understand or scrutinize, and who kept the touring pace at a level that served revenue generation rather than the creative or personal needs of the artist generating it. Noel Redding described asking Jeffrey at one point where he was going with briefcases full of the band's money and being told, in effect, that it was none of his business. Redding was eventually pushed out of the band. The message was clear enough. The legal complications added pressure from another direction. Before the Experience had even been formed, Hendrix had signed a recording agreement with a New York producer named Ed Chalpin. That contract predated his fame and had been signed under circumstances that Hendrix had not fully understood at the time. It came back as a serious problem once he was successful, leading to litigation that dragged through the legal system for years and required, as part of its eventual settlement, that Hendrix hand over an entire album's worth of material to satisfy the obligation. The legal fees were significant. The distraction from the work was worse. In May 1969, on his way to perform at the Toronto International Pop Festival, Canadian customs officers found a quantity of heroin in Hendrix's luggage at the airport. He was arrested and charged. He maintained consistently and insistently that the drugs had been placed in his bag without his knowledge, by a fan, or by someone deliberately trying to cause him trouble. He was tried in December 1969, and after a relatively brief deliberation, the jury acquitted him. The acquittal was a relief, but the arrest and the months of legal proceedings that preceded the verdict had consumed substantial time, money, and mental energy that Hendrix had very little of to spare. He headlined Woodstock in August 1969, going on last, in the grey early morning hours after the festival had officially ended, playing to the hundreds of thousands of people who had stayed through 2 days and nights of mud and music, specifically to see him close it. His performance of The Star-Spangled Banner on a single electric guitar, bending and stretching the national anthem until it contained sounds that resembled sirens, explosions, and the feedback of a country at war with itself, became one of the most analysed musical moments in the cultural history of the 1960s. He said very little about what he had intended by it. The silence on his part only deepened its resonance. After Woodstock, the Jimi Hendrix Experience effectively dissolved. The tensions of the preceding 2 years had become unmanageable. Jeffrey fired the drummer from Hendrix's new Band of Gypsies project, Buddy Miles, after the band's second major performance at Madison Square Garden in January 1970 fell apart badly. By some accounts, because someone had given Hendrix something that made performing impossible. Jeffrey pushed to reform the original Experience lineup. Hendrix ended up on the Cry of Love tour in 1970 with Billy Cox on bass and Mitch Mitchell on drums, playing new material alongside familiar songs for audiences who were loyal but who increasingly showed up expecting a specific, established version of Jimi Hendrix rather than a musician in the middle of figuring out what came next. What Hendrix wanted to do next was genuinely different from anything he had done before. He had met Miles Davis in 1969, and the conversations between them had pointed toward musical territory that had nothing to do with the rock trio format. He had spoken with the arranger Gil Evans about collaborative possibilities. He was interested in jazz harmony, orchestration, and compositional complexity that the Guitar Hero framework of the Experience could not accommodate. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars building Electric Lady Studios in Greenwich Village, specifically to give himself the kind of total creative control that borrowed studio time had never allowed. The studio opened in August 1970. He spent a few weeks working there before the European tour pulled him away. He was still intending to return. The final weeks. The European leg of the Cry of Love tour ran through late August and into September 1970. It ended abruptly when Billy Cox fell seriously ill, believed to be the result of something he had been given at a party in Copenhagen, and the remaining dates had to be cancelled. Hendrix returned to London in early September. The people who saw him during those 2 weeks in London described him in ways that did not entirely agree with each other. Some said he seemed relaxed, enjoying the city without the pressure of an upcoming show. Others described a man who was visibly unwell, struggling to sleep, carrying a restlessness that persisted regardless of where he was or who he was with. On September 14th, he spent most of the afternoon and evening with the record producer Alan Douglas, talking about his career plans and the musical directions he wanted to pursue. In the early hours of September 15th, he went with Douglas to Heathrow Airport to see him off on a flight back to New York. That day, his close friend and confidant Sharon Lawrence was in London. She found him in a state she later described as jittery and angry. He told her that he couldn't sleep and couldn't focus enough to write. He was struggling to concentrate on the work that mattered to him most, and the so-called friends who surrounded him in London were not helping. It was a portrait of someone who was exhausted in a way that a night's sleep wouldn't fix. On September 16th, he declined a scheduled meeting with his attorney, Henry Steingarten, who wanted to discuss the outstanding legal issues. That same afternoon, he made a phone call to begin the process of separating from Michael Jeffrey as his manager, a move he had been contemplating for some time and had finally decided to act on. He was at the Cumberland Hotel, where he had been staying, and Monika Dannemann arrived to join him. Monika Dannemann was a German painter and former ice skater whom Hendrix had first met in January 1969 in Düsseldorf, at a show on his European tour. She had rented an apartment at the Samarkand Hotel at 22 Lansdowne Crescent in Notting Hill in late August 1970, partly in anticipation of his return to London from the tour. By mid-September, Hendrix was spending his days and nights there with her. On September 17th, they spent the afternoon together. Dannemann photographed him in the garden of the Samarkand Hotel, sitting in the sun with his guitar, a black Fender Stratocaster he had nicknamed Black Beauty, resting across his lap. The photographs from that afternoon are among the last ever taken of him. Biographers who have studied them closely note that he looks pale and not entirely well, and that his smiles, when they appear at all, seem effortful. That evening, they shared wine and dinner at the apartment. At some point in the night, they attended a party hosted by a business associate. It appears that Hendricks took an amphetamine, what was known colloquially at the time as a black bomber, during the party, which was common in the music world of that era, to get through long, demanding evenings. They returned to the Samarkand apartment in the early hours of September 18th. According to Dahnemann's account, they talked through most of what remained of the night before finally going to sleep around 7 in the morning. September 18th, 1970. What happened between 7 in the morning and the moment when Monica Diahann called for an ambulance at 11:18 a.m. has never been fully established. Dahnemann's own account of the timing and the sequence of events shifted significantly in various interviews and statements she gave over the following years, and the accounts provided by the paramedics who arrived at the apartment do not align fully with what she described. What the medical evidence established, and what the inquest confirmed, is less disputed. Jimi Hendrix had taken 9 tablets of Vesparax, a strong German sleeping pill that had been prescribed to Diahann. The standard recommended dose was half a tablet. He had taken 18 times the recommended amount. He had also consumed wine during the course of the evening. The combination of a heavy barbiturate dose and alcohol caused him to lose consciousness, become sick in his sleep, and unable to clear his airway. The result was asphyxiation. The paramedics who arrived at 11:27 a.m. found him alone in the flat. The vomit, by their account, had already dried, indicating that he had been in that condition for some time before help was called. Diahann was not present when they arrived, despite her later claims to have been in the ambulance with him. He was transported to St. Mary Abbott's Hospital in Kensington. Dr. John Bannister, who attended to him at the hospital, later described the scene in terms that made clear there had been no realistic prospect of saving him by the time he arrived. The doctor pronounced him dead at 12:45 in the afternoon. The coroner's inquest, presided over by Gavin Thurston and concluded on September 28th, found that Hendricks had died of asphyxia caused by barbiturate intoxication. The verdict recorded was an open one, meaning the coroner found no evidence of deliberate self-harm, but also lacked sufficient information about the exact circumstances to make a more definitive finding. The question of how 9 tablets came to be taken, and whether Hendricks understood the potency of what he was taking, a German medication he would not have been familiar with, was never answered to anyone's satisfaction. The questions that never went away. In the years after Hendrix's death, a set of questions accumulated around the circumstances that have never been fully resolved. Monica Diahann remained at the center of the controversy for the rest of her own life. Her accounts of the final hours shifted repeatedly. The timing, the sequence of events, whether she was with him in the ambulance, what he said and did in the hours before he fell asleep. In 1975, she made claims in press interviews suggesting that Hendricks had been deliberately harmed by people connected to organized crime, a theory she linked to the broader criminal associations she believed surrounded his career. The claims were never substantiated. Other Hendricks associates pushed back on Dahnemann's version of events from other directions. Kathy Etchingham, who had been Hendrix's girlfriend from 1966 to 1969 and was one of the most significant people in his personal life during his London years, worked for years to challenge Dahnemann's account and submitted new evidence to authorities in 1993 in an effort to have the inquest reopened. The effort did not result in a new inquest. In 1996, a court found Diahann in contempt of court related to libel proceedings connected to her claims about Hendrix's death. 2 days after that finding, she was found dead in her car in East Sussex. She was 50 years old. The death was ruled a suicide. The most dramatic claim about Hendrix's death came in 2009, when a former roadie named James Tappy Wright published a book in which he alleged that Michael Jeffrey had confessed to him in a drunken conversation in 1971 that he had arranged Hendrix's death. Wright quoted Jeffrey as describing going to the apartment with associates, forcing pills into Hendrix's mouth, and washing them down with wine, motivated by the belief that Hendrix, who was worth more financially to him dead than alive, and who was in the process of trying to leave him as a manager, needed to be stopped. Wright also claimed Jeffrey had taken out a life insurance policy on Hendrix worth approximately $2 million, naming himself as beneficiary. Jeffrey died in a plane crash near Nantes, France, in March 1973, leaving no possibility of confrontation or denial. The claim has never been corroborated by any independent evidence. Serious Hendrix biographers and researchers have generally treated it as unverified and unverifiable, a story that cannot be proven or disproven, made by a single witness about a man who has been dead since 1973. What is documented independently is that Jeffrey was, by the accounts of nearly everyone who dealt with him professionally, a manager who treated Hendrix's financial interests as secondary to his own, who redirected income in ways his client did not fully understand, and who kept Hendrix working at a pace that served the business more than it served the man. Whether that rises to anything beyond exploitation is something the available record cannot answer. What can be said is that by September 1970, Jimi Hendrix was exhausted, physically unwell, unable to sleep, unable to write, tangled in legal and financial difficulties that had been allowed to compound for years, and in the process of trying to extricate himself from a management relationship that he had finally understood was not in his interest. He was 27 years old. He had been a global superstar for 4 years. He was planning what came next with the seriousness of someone who believed there was a great deal more to do. He did not get the chance. What the world lost. The body of work Jimi Hendrix produced in 4 years of international prominence is small in volume and impossible to overstate in impact. 3 studio albums with the experience. Are you experienced? In 1967, Axis, Bold as Love, also in 1967, and Electric Ladyland in 1968, the last of which was his only album to reach #1 on the American charts, and which he produced himself, by which point the studio had become an instrument he played as naturally as the guitar. One live album from the Band of Gypsies, recorded at the Fillmore East on New Year's Day 1970. The Woodstock performance. The Isle of Wight Festival in August 1970, which drew over 600,000 people and turned out to be one of the last major concerts of his life. And then the recordings from Electric Lady Studios that were being assembled in the weeks before his death, sessions eventually released posthumously as The Cry of Love, and later, in fuller form, as First Rays of the New Rising Sun. Those recordings point clearly toward a direction that was taking him away from the familiar and towards something that nobody could entirely predict. More compositionally ambitious, more informed by jazz, built around ideas that had nothing to do with the guitar hero spectacle that had made him famous in 1967. The collaboration with Gil Evans never happened. The record with Miles Davis that both of them had spoken about as a possibility never materialized. The orchestral arrangements Hendrix had been sketching in notebooks remained unfinished. Electric Lady Studios, the space he had built specifically to realize work like that, stood open and waiting. He had used it for a few weeks. He had barely started. The musicians who encountered Hendrix at the height of his powers did not speak about him in ordinary terms. Eric Clapton has described hearing Hendrix play as a genuinely disorienting experience, a confrontation with someone who had not simply gotten better at the things everyone was trying to do, but who had left the whole framework behind. Pete Townshend described Hendrix as having made the guitar do things that nobody had previously imagined it was capable of. Bob Dylan, after Hendrix's version of All Along the Watchtower was released in 1968, found himself unable to play the song in his original arrangement any longer. As if Hendrix had permanently altered the way the song existed in the world. Miles Davis spoke about Hendrix in the context of where music was heading, not where it had been, which was a particular distinction coming from a man who measured musicians by exactly that standard. Rolling Stone magazine named him the greatest guitarist of all time in 2003. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which inducted him in 1992, described him as arguably the greatest instrumentalist in the history of rock music. The citation is notable for its precision. Not the most technically flashy, not the most commercially successful. The greatest instrumentalist, meaning the person who most fully understood and extended what could be done with the instrument, and who did so in a way that changed what everyone who came after him understood was possible. The funeral was held at Dunlap Baptist Church in Seattle's Rainier Valley on October 1st, 1970. More than 200 people attended, traveling in 24 limousines from the church to Greenwood Cemetery in Renton, Washington. Among those at the service were Mitch Mitchell and Noel Redding, Miles Davis, John Hammond, the Columbia Records talent scout, who had also discovered Bob Dylan and Billie Holiday, and guitarist Johnny Winter. Hendrix's body was interred at Greenwood Cemetery beside his mother Lucille, who had been buried there since 1958. The boy who had lost her at 15 and never fully got over it was laid to rest beside her, 12 years later, and 27 years old. Electric Lady Studios is still operating in Greenwich Village today. It has hosted recordings by major artists across every decade since Hendrix's death. It is his most tangible physical legacy in the city, a building designed from the ground up to give a musician complete creative control, in the place where he had spent years going unrecognized. The last photographs ever taken of him are the ones Monica Danneman shot in the garden of the Samarkand Hotel on the afternoon of September 17th, 1970. He is sitting in the afternoon sun with Black Beauty resting across his lap. He looks pale. He looks tired. In a few of the frames, he is almost smiling. He was 27 years old. He had been famous for 4 years. He had already done enough to be remembered as long as music is remembered. And somewhere in the sessions from Electric Lady, in the recordings still being assembled when he died, in the conversations with Miles Davis and Gil Evans that were pointing somewhere genuinely new, there is the shape of the music he was about to make. Music the world never got to hear. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.